There is a moment near the end of this story that stops everything. A king is throwing a party. Music, wine, torchlight across the faces of the most powerful men in the region. A girl dances. The king, loose from too much wine and wanting to look generous in front of his guests, makes a promise he cannot take back. And somewhere beneath the palace, in a cell cut into the rock of a cliff above the Dead Sea, a man is waiting in the dark. He has been waiting for months. He went into that cell as the most talked about figure in Judea. People had walked for days to hear him speak. Soldiers had asked him what they were supposed to do with their lives. Religious leaders had sent official delegations to find out who he thought he was. The man he baptized in the Jordan River had been healing the sick, giving sight to the blind, making the lame walk across dusty roads under the open sky. And this man, who had seen all of that, who had stood in the water and watched the heavens open, was sitting in a cell asking a question that should have been settled years ago. He sent 2 of his followers to find Jesus and ask, "Are you the one we have been waiting for? Or should we keep looking?" That question is what this whole story is about. Not the dancing girl, not the silver plate, not the king who did not have the courage to say no. Those things matter, and we will get there. But underneath all of it is this: a man who gave everything to a purpose, who saw things most people never see, who told the truth when telling the truth cost him everything, and who still sat in the dark and wondered, how does a person get there? What kind of life leads to that cell? That question, that moment. To answer that, we have to go back. Not just to the beginning of John's life. We have to go back 400 years before he was born, to the last time God spoke, and to what 4 centuries of silence does to a people who are still waiting to hear the voice again. Chapter 1. 400 Years of Nothing. The last words of the Old Testament are a warning and a promise wrapped together. The prophet Malachi, writing sometime in the 400s before Christ, closes the Hebrew scriptures with this: God is going to send Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord arrives. Elijah will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. And if that does not happen, God will come and strike the land with a curse. Then the text ends. And for 400 years, nothing. No prophet, no dream, no angel standing in a field at night with a word from heaven, no vision, no burning bush, no still small voice after the wind and the earthquake and the fire, the channel that had been open since Abraham, that had carried the voice of God to Moses and Samuel and David and Isaiah and Jeremiah and 100 others across 1,000 years of history, went silent. 400 years is not an abstract number. It is longer than the United States has existed as a country. It is longer than the gap between Shakespeare and the present day. If you were born at the beginning of that silence, your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren would be the ones who finally heard the voice again. The Jewish people in those 4 centuries did not sit still. History moved through them the way a river moves through a landscape, reshaping everything it touches. Alexander the Great arrived in the 300s before Christ and swept through the entire eastern Mediterranean world in roughly a decade. He did not just conquer territory. He carried a culture with him. And that culture, Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek ways of organizing a city and understanding the world, began to seep into everything by the time Alexander died at 32, without ever having lost a battle. The world that the Hebrew prophets had spoken into was already gone. A new world was forming around the ruins of the old one. After Alexander came his generals, dividing his empire among themselves, like men splitting an inheritance. The Ptolemies took Egypt, the Seleucids took Syria, and Judea, sitting between them, became what it had always been and would always be: the land that 2 larger powers fought over because it sat at the crossroads of everything. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who called himself Epiphanes, which means God made visible, decided around 167 before Christ that the Jewish people needed to stop being Jewish. He walked into the temple in Jerusalem, set up an altar to Zeus in the holy place, sacrificed a pig on it, and outlawed the practice of Judaism under penalty of death. Mothers who circumcised their sons were killed along with their infants. Scrolls of the Torah were burned. The Sabbath became illegal. What followed was the Maccabean revolt. A priestly family called the Hasmoneans looked at what was happening to their people and decided that death was preferable to what Antiochus was offering. They fought against every reasonable military calculation. They won. They rededicated the temple in 164 before Christ, and the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah exists to this day because of what that family did in those years. But the Hasmoneans, having won their war, did what winners often do. They settled into power. And power does to people what it has always done. The priestly family that had fought for the soul of their people slowly became the kind of rulers their people had fought to overthrow. By the time the Romans arrived, the Hasmonean dynasty was collapsing from the inside, torn apart by brothers fighting each other for the throne. Pompey, the Roman general, marched into Jerusalem in 63 before Christ. He did something that no foreign conqueror had done since Babylon. He walked into the temple, through the outer courts, through the inner courts, past the altar, and into the Holy of Holies, the innermost room, the place where the high priest entered only once a year on the Day of Atonement, the place where the presence of God was understood to dwell. He walked in, he looked around, and he walked out without touching anything. Ancient sources tell us that Pompey was baffled. He had expected treasure, an idol, something. Instead, he found an empty room. The Romans wrote about it afterward with a kind of bemused contempt. The God of the Jews had no image. Their holiest room contained nothing visible. For the Jewish people watching a Roman general walk into their most sacred space, it was not strange. It was devastating. Their land was now a Roman province. Their king, Herod the Great, was not even fully Jewish. He was a skilled political survivor who had maneuvered his way into Roman favor and sat on a throne kept warm by the permission of Caesar. He rebuilt the temple into one of the most spectacular structures in the ancient world. Enormous, gleaming, the wonder of every traveler who saw it. And it was still, in a real sense, occupied territory. This is the world that was waiting when John the Baptist was born. But you cannot understand what John meant to that world without understanding what the silence had done to the people living inside it. 400 years without a prophet does not produce a people who have given up. It produces the opposite. It produces a people wound tight with expectation, reading old texts for hidden timetables, organizing themselves into movements that each claim to have the right answer to the same question: when is God going to act? The Pharisees believed the answer was strict obedience to the law. If every Jewish person kept every commandment perfectly for a single day, the Messiah would come. Their project was national moral renovation, one household at a time. The Sadducees had made their peace with Roman power. They controlled the temple establishment, the high priesthood, the religious economy of Jerusalem. They were the ones who benefited most from the current arrangement. And they had the theological convictions to match their interests. Keep the temple running. Keep the Romans satisfied. Do not talk too loudly about a coming kingdom that might upset the balance. Out in the desert near the Dead Sea, a community called the Essenes had concluded that Jerusalem was too corrupt to save. They had separated themselves from the city entirely, copying scrolls and waiting for a final war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, a cosmic conflict in which God would finally settle everything. The Zealots believed the answer was armed resistance. Rome was not going to leave on its own. God helped those who helped themselves. And helping yourself in occupied Judea meant picking up a sword. And scattered across the countryside were ordinary people, farmers and fishermen and tax collectors and the poor, who had no particular movement, but who felt in their bones what 400 years of silence felt like. They lit the Sabbath candles. They said the prayers. They told their children about Moses and David and Elijah. And they waited. Into that pressure. Into that accumulated weight of 4 centuries of waiting. A priest named Zacharias walked into the temple one morning to perform his duties. He had no idea that the waiting was about to end. He had no idea that he was about to become part of the answer. Chapter 2. The Priest Who Lost His Voice. Zacharias had spent his whole life doing things correctly. That is not a criticism. In the world of first-century Jewish priesthood, doing things correctly was the entire point. The priestly divisions, the schedules of temple service, the precise rituals handed down through generations. These were not bureaucratic formalities. They were the architecture of a relationship between a people and their God, maintained with care because the relationship itself demanded care. He belonged to the division of Abijah, one of 24 priestly divisions that rotated through temple service on a schedule going back to the time of King David. His wife Elizabeth came from the same priestly line, a descendant of Aaron, the first high priest, by birth and by marriage. Zacharias was exactly where he was supposed to be, embedded in the tradition, faithful to the practice, doing what his father had done and his father before him. Luke, who gives us the only account of Zacharias, describes him and Elizabeth in a single sentence that carries enormous weight. They were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Both of them, righteous, blameless, and they had no children. In first-century Jewish society, childlessness was not just a private sorrow. It carried a public meaning that pressed on a person from every direction. The assumption, rarely spoken but always present, was that barrenness signaled something, some hidden fault, some unresolved accounting with God. This was not fair. The book of Job exists partly to argue against exactly this kind of thinking. But fairness and social reality are different things. And Elizabeth had carried the social reality of her childlessness for decades. They were both old now. The prayers they had prayed about this had been prayed so long ago that praying them again would have felt less like faith and more like reopening a wound that had finally, painfully, closed. Then came the day when Zacharias drew the assignment that most priests never received. The lot fell to him to enter the inner sanctuary of the temple and burn incense on the golden altar. This was one of the most sacred duties in all of Jewish religious life, performed twice daily, morning and evening, but performed by a different priest each time, chosen by lot from among the hundreds serving that week. The tradition in the Talmud suggests that a priest might only receive this honor once in his entire lifetime, if at all. Some served faithfully for years without ever being chosen. The people were outside, gathered in the court, praying during the hour of incense. Zacharias went in. What the angel said to him was not complicated. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son. You shall call his name John. He will be great before the Lord. He will drink no wine or strong drink. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from his mother's womb. He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah. That last line, the spirit and power of Elijah, any priest in Zacharias' position would have known exactly what that meant. Malachi's promise, the one that closed the Hebrew Scriptures, the one that had been waiting 400 years to be fulfilled. The angel was telling Zacharias that the waiting was over. And Zacharias said, "How can I know this? I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." It is easy to read that response as simple unbelief. But Gabriel did not respond with anger. He responded with what looks, in retrospect, like medicine for the specific problem Zacharias had. Zacharias would be silent until the child was born. There is a tradition of reading this as punishment. But consider what 9 months of silence actually does to a person. It removes the escape route of words. You cannot fill the space with explanations or questions or the sound of your own voice working through something out loud. You sit with what you were told. You have nothing to do but think about it. Turn it over. Let it settle into the places where it needs to settle. Zacharias could not speak, but he could hear everything. He walked out of the temple and the crowd was waiting. Because the priest did not stay inside this long. Something had happened in there. Zacharias stood in front of them and could not say a word. He made signs. And Luke records that they perceived he had seen a vision in the temple. He went home. Elizabeth conceived. She stayed in seclusion for 5 months. Luke gives us her words during that time. And they are the words of a woman who has spent decades carrying something heavy and has finally been allowed to put it down. God has looked on me, she said, to take away my reproach among people, not to give her a prophet, not to fulfill a cosmic plan, to take away her reproach. The personal and the cosmic were running on exactly the same track, as they always do in these stories. Zacharias, meanwhile, was silent. He had 9 months to think about what the angel had told him, 9 months to read Malachi again, and Isaiah, and all the prophets who had spoken about the one who would come before the Lord. 9 months to understand that the son his wife was carrying was not just an answer to a private prayer. He was the hinge of history. When you understand something at that level, you do not say it casually. You find the words large enough to hold it. And when Zacharias finally opened his mouth, 400 years of silence ended. What came out was not relief or surprise or simple gratitude. What came out was a prophecy, as if every word he had wanted to say for 9 months had been waiting behind his closed lips. Organized and ready. We will get to those words. They deserve their own space. But first, we need to follow the story 6 months forward, to the moment when 2 impossible pregnancies crossed paths, and a child in his mother's womb recognized something that the adults in the room were still trying to understand. Chapter 3. 2 women, at the edge of the impossible. Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant when her young cousin came to visit. Mary had just had her own encounter with Gabriel. The angel had told her she would conceive and bear a son. And she had asked the only honest question available to her, "How can this be, since I have not been with a man?" Gabriel had answered her question and then, almost as an afterthought, had told her something else. Your relative Elizabeth, the one everyone called barren, has also conceived a son in her old age, because nothing will be impossible with God. That detail, Elizabeth's pregnancy, seems to have been what pushed Mary into action. Luke says she arose and went with haste into the hill country of Judah. Not a short trip. The journey from Nazareth in Galilee to the hill country south of Jerusalem was somewhere between 3 and 4 days on foot. Mary made it quickly, driven by something that does not need to be explained. When you have just been told the most impossible thing imaginable about your own life, you go find the person who is living proof that impossible things happen. She arrived. She called out a greeting, and before Elizabeth could form a response, before any words were exchanged about what had happened to either of them, the child in Elizabeth's womb moved. Luke uses a specific Greek word here. The child leaped, not stirred, not kicked, not moved in the ordinary way that a 6-month pregnancy produces ordinary movement. Leaped. The same word appears in the Greek translation of the Old Testament to describe David dancing before the Ark of the Lord when it was brought into Jerusalem. It is a word of joy, of recognition, of a response so immediate and so physical that the body cannot contain it. John, 6 months old in his mother's womb, recognized the presence of Jesus before either of them had drawn a breath outside their mothers. Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she cried out in a loud voice, The word Luke uses for her cry is not the word for gentle speech or quiet conversation. It is the word for a shout, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than ordinary volume. And what she said was this: "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And why is this granted to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For behold, when the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy. The mother of my Lord." Elizabeth did not work her way toward that conclusion through theological reasoning. She did not sit down with the relevant scriptures and calculate. The recognition came through her child, through his leap, before she had time to think, and she named what she recognized immediately. This moment is easy to read past because it sits in a familiar part of a familiar story. But slow down with it. Elizabeth was an old woman who had lived her whole life in the religious establishment of first-century Judaism. She knew her scriptures. She knew what it meant to call someone Lord. And she said it about the unborn child of her young cousin before that child had done a single thing to earn the title. The only explanation she offered was the leap. The baby leaped for joy. And something in that physical movement told Elizabeth everything she needed to know. Mary stayed for about 3 months. The two women who had been given impossible things to carry lived together in the hill country while their children grew inside them. Luke does not tell us what they talked about during those months, what questions they asked each other, what fears they shared in the evenings when the day's work was done. He gives us Mary's song, the Magnificat, which Mary spoke in response to Elizabeth's greeting. And then the text moves forward. But those 3 months matter. Mary was very young, probably in her early to mid-teens by the reckoning of the culture. She was unmarried and pregnant in a society where that combination carried consequences she could not fully predict. Joseph had not yet been told. She did not know yet how that conversation would go. She had been given the most extraordinary news a human being has ever received, and she was carrying it essentially alone. Elizabeth was the first person who responded to Mary's situation, not with confusion or fear or careful social management, but with joy, immediate, unqualified, shouted out loud joy. That mattered in ways we cannot fully measure. We do not know exactly how it mattered to Mary in the long arc of her life, but it mattered. And for John, those 3 months in the womb while Mary was in the house meant something that the rest of his life would bear out. The first environment he developed in was one where the presence of Jesus was near. Before he had eyes to see or ears to hear, his body had already responded to that presence with the only movement available to him. He leaped. It was the first and most uncomplicated thing John the Baptist ever did. Before the camel hair and the locusts and the crowds at the Jordan and the confrontations with Pharisees and the prison cell on the cliff above the Dead Sea, before all of it, he leaped toward what he recognized. And he never really stopped doing that his whole life. Mary left when the time approached for Elizabeth to give birth. She went home to Nazareth and to everything waiting for her there. And 8 days after John was born, the family gathered for the circumcision. That gathering is where the next fracture in the story appears. Chapter 4: The Name That Broke the Silence. In first-century Jewish culture, naming a son was not a personal preference. It was a statement, a declaration of lineage, of belonging, of the chain of identity that connected a child to every generation before him. Names ran in families. Names carried the weight of the ancestors who had held them. When a son was born into a priestly household, his name was expected to come from within the family line, a way of saying this child belongs to this people, this tradition, this story. The neighbors and relatives gathered 8 days after John's birth, and they assumed they knew what would happen. The child would be named after his father. Zacharias was a good name. It meant God has remembered. There were worse things to name a son. Elizabeth said no. His name is John. The room pushed back immediately. No one in your family has this name. They turned to Zacharias. The father the one whose voice should settle the question. They made signs to him, asking what he wanted the child called. Zacharias asked for a writing tablet, and he wrote, "His name is John," 4 words on a tablet. And immediately his mouth opened, and his tongue was freed, and he spoke. Luke says the first thing he did was bless God. After 9 months of silence, the first sound Zacharias made was not a question, or an explanation, or a catch-up conversation with his wife. It was praise directed outward, toward the one he understood to be responsible for all of it. The neighbors were afraid. That is the word Luke uses. Not amazed, not delighted. Afraid, because this was outside the category of ordinary things. A mute old priest who had been silent since the day he went into the temple suddenly spoke. And the child in the cradle, 8 days old, had a name that nobody in the family had ever carried. All these things were talked about through all the hill country of Judea. People wondered and asked, "What then will this child be?" It is the right question, and Zacharias answered it, though not in the way anyone expected. What came out of him when he finally spoke was a poem, a prophecy, the Benedictus, as it has been called ever since the Latin translation gave it that name from its opening word blessed. To understand the Benedictus, you have to understand the condition in which it was produced. Zacharias had been silent for 9 months. During those months, he had watched his wife's pregnancy progress. He had lived with the knowledge that Gabriel had given him in the temple, turning it over in the long, silent hours the way a person turns over something precious and fragile, examining it from every angle because they cannot put it down. He had read the scriptures with new eyes, seeing the connections between what the angel had told him and what Malachi had written and what Isaiah had written and what all the prophets together had been pointing toward. And he had not been able to say any of it out loud. So when his mouth finally opened, everything that had accumulated across 9 months of enforced silence came out at once, organized and weighty, and aimed at the child in the cradle. "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel," he said, "for he has visited and redeemed his people, and has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David." That opening line is a declaration that the 400 years of silence were over. The word visited carries specific meaning in the Hebrew tradition. When God visits his people, things change. Creation happens. Covenants are made. Captives are freed. Zacharias was saying the thing the whole people have been waiting for has begun. It has begun here, in this house, with this child. And then he turned to the child directly. "And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High. For you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people in the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace." Stop at that last image. Those who sit in darkness and in the shadow of death. Zacharias was a priest. He knew his Isaiah. He knew Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 9, the passages about light coming to people in darkness. The child with 4 names. The suffering servant. The one who would carry what his people could not carry. He was placing his newborn son inside that story, telling the child what he would spend his life pointing toward. You will go before. Not you will be. You will go before. From his first day in the world, John's identity was defined relationally, not by what he would accomplish, but by what he would prepare for, not by who he was, but by who was coming after him. Now hold that alongside something the text records a few verses earlier. Something easy to miss because it sits quietly between the neighbors, arguing about the name and the prophecy. Zacharias speaks. The 4 names Zacharias and Elizabeth had carried their whole lives tell you something about the world John was born into. Zacharias meant God has remembered. Elizabeth meant my God is an oath, or my God is abundance. The names of the parents of the forerunner were not accidental in a culture where names were theology. God has remembered, and my God is an oath, are exactly the names you would expect to find on the parents of a child born at the end of 400 years of silence. And the name John, in Hebrew, Yochanan, it meant God has shown grace, or God is gracious. The neighbors said no one in the family had this name. They were right. The name did not come from the family line. It came from Gabriel, delivered to Zacharias in the temple before any of this began. The name was chosen before conception, before pregnancy, before the 9 months of silence. It was the first thing in John's story that arrived from outside the expected order. God is gracious. That is the name John carried every day of his life. Every time someone called his name in the marketplace, or on the road, or at the river, they were speaking a theological statement about the character of the God he served. He did not choose the name. The name was given to him before he existed to have opinions about it. This is not a small thing to say over a child. It is a beautiful thing, in its way, to tell a person from the beginning that their purpose is larger than their own biography. But it is also demanding. It asks the child, before the child can understand anything, to organize his entire life around a center that is not himself. Most people spend their whole lives trying to become the center of something. Zacharias was telling his son from day one, that is not your story. Whether John fully understood what his father had pronounced over him, we cannot know. He was 8 days old. The words landed in the air above him and went wherever words go when their intended audience is too young to hear them. But Elizabeth heard them. And the neighbors who had gathered and then gone home to talk about all of it heard them too. The question they carried out of that house was the same question every generation since has carried. What then will this child be? The answer was already written. In Malachi, in Isaiah, in the scroll of the prophet that a man named Philip would one day explain to a traveler from Ethiopia on a desert road. The answer was already there. But John had to grow into it. And growing into it meant going somewhere that no one in his priestly family had ever gone. It meant going to the desert. Not for a week, not for a season, for 30 years. Chapter 5. The Desert Years. What silence does to a man. There is a single sentence in the Gospel of Luke that covers 30 years of a man's life. The child grew and became strong in spirit. And he was in the wilderness until the day of his public appearance to Israel. That is it. One sentence, 30 years. Luke, who is careful about detail, who gives us the political context of the Roman Empire when John begins his ministry, who tracks the movements of people across his gospel with a historian's precision, chose to cover 3 decades of John's life with a subordinate clause. This is not an accident. Luke knew what he was doing. The wilderness years are not the part of the story where things happen in the way that stories usually require things to happen. They are the part of the story where a person becomes capable of the things that will happen later. And that process does not make for easy narration because it is slow and interior and largely invisible from the outside. But we cannot skip it, because the man who stood at the Jordan River and shook Judea was not born that way. He was made that way, and the desert made him. Start with the decision itself. John was the son of a priest in first-century Jewish society. That means something specific and concrete. Priestly identity was hereditary. Sons of priests became priests. They learned the rituals, memorized the schedules, trained in the precise requirements of temple service. When Zacharias' son came of age, the expectation of everyone who knew the family would have been straightforward. He would take his place in the division of Abijah, serve his weeks at the temple, and carry the tradition forward the way his father had and his father before him. Instead, he went to the desert. We do not have a scene of that departure. We do not know if there was a conversation with Zacharias, an explanation given, a blessing asked for or withheld. We do not know if Elizabeth wept or if she had always known this was coming. What we know is the result. A young man from a priestly family walked away from the most prestigious religious institution in his world and chose the wilderness. The wilderness he chose was specific. The Judean desert south and east of Jerusalem, running down toward the Dead Sea, is one of the harshest landscapes in that part of the world. The terrain drops dramatically from the hills around Jerusalem, more than 3,000 feet in less than 20 miles. And as it drops, it dries. The soil turns to chalk and then to dust. The hills become sculpted and barren, cut through by wadis that run with water for a few weeks in winter and are bone dry the rest of the year. The summer heat is punishing. The winter nights are cold in ways that surprise people who think of the Middle East as uniformly warm. It is not a comfortable place. It was never meant to be. But it was a place with a history that any person who had read the Hebrew scriptures would have known in their bones. Moses spent 40 years in a desert before he led anyone anywhere. Elijah fled to the wilderness when Jezebel threatened his life. And it was in the desert that he heard the still small voice after the wind and the earthquake and the fire. David hid in the wilderness of Judea when Saul was hunting him, writing psalms in the caves above the Dead Sea. The Hebrew understanding of the desert was not simply that it was a hard place. It was a place where the noise of ordinary life fell away, and the things that were real became visible. John grew up in that understanding. He had heard about the Benedictus, what his father said over him at his circumcision. He knew the Isaiah passages. He knew Malachi. And he knew that the voice crying in the wilderness was his calling. Not a metaphor he was supposed to apply to a career inside the Jerusalem temple. There is a question scholars have debated for a long time, and it is worth spending a moment with. Did John have any connection to the community at Qumran? Qumran was a settlement about a mile from the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in the same general region where John spent his years in the wilderness. The community there, almost certainly the group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, was made up of Jewish men who had concluded that the Jerusalem temple was corrupt and that the only faithful response was separation. They copied scriptures, observed a strict common life, practiced ritual immersion in water as a regular part of their community practice, and waited for the end of the age, which they believed was imminent. The geographical proximity is real. Some of the theological preoccupations overlap. The emphasis on repentance, on baptism, on preparation for a coming judgment, on Isaiah 40 as the key text for understanding their moment in history. These are all present in both John and at Qumran, but the differences matter more than the similarities. John was shaped by the wilderness. He was not defined by withdrawal from the world. The whole point of John's ministry was public engagement. The Qumran community turned away from the nation. John turned toward it, walked to the most publicly accessible river in the region, and invited the whole country to come to him. He baptized individuals and sent them back into their lives with instructions for how to live differently inside those lives. He talked to soldiers and tax collectors, the very people most embedded in the Roman system that the Qumran community had rejected entirely. So what was he doing out there for 30 years? He was learning to hear. That sounds simple, and it is not. The noise that fills an ordinary life in an ordinary society is not just the noise of sound. It is the noise of other people's expectations. The continuous low-level pressure of a community's assumptions about who you are and what you are for. It is the noise of ambition, of comparison, of the daily work of building and maintaining a social self. Strip all of that away, and what is left is a question: who are you when no one is watching? John stripped it away for 3 decades. He ate what the desert provided: locusts, which were a legitimate food source in that world, mentioned in the purity codes of Leviticus, wild honey from the rock. He wore what was available and practical: the rough woven cloth of camel hair that would have been cheap and durable in a way that the fine linen robes of the Jerusalem priesthood were not. His clothing and his diet were not affectations. They were the natural result of a man who had decided that the desert was his address and had organized his life accordingly. The prophets of the Hebrew Bible almost always had a period of preparation before their public ministry. Moses was 80 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Having spent 40 years in Midian after fleeing Egypt, Elijah appeared suddenly in the narrative with no backstory, but he disappeared into the wilderness multiple times throughout his ministry, as if the desert was where he refueled. Paul, the apostle, after his encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, went to Arabia for 3 years before beginning his public work. The pattern is consistent enough that it looks deliberate. The people who are going to say important things in public have to spend a long time in private first. Because the private time is not wasted time. It is the time when the message is being worked into the bones. When the person stops being someone who knows something and becomes someone who is something. John came out of the desert with a message that did not sound like it had been assembled from available materials. It sounded like it had been carried for a long time. It sounded like something refined by 30 years of silence until everything unnecessary had been burned away, and what remained was only what was true. There is one more thing the desert gave John that deserves to be named. It gave him no stake in the current arrangement. He had not built a career inside the temple system. He had no position to protect, no patronage to maintain, no reputation within the religious establishment that required managing. When he walked out of the desert and opened his mouth, he owed nothing to anyone. The Pharisees and Sadducees who came to the Jordan hoping to get his endorsement would discover this very quickly. A man who has lived on locusts and wild honey for 30 years is not impressed by your title or your lineage, or your threat to report him to the authorities. He had already given all of that up before it was offered. When the word finally came to John in the wilderness, it found a man who had been waiting for it longer than most people wait for anything, and the waiting had not made him anxious or desperate. It had made him ready. The question is what ready looks like. The answer is standing at the edge of the Jordan River, watching the water move, knowing that the whole country is about to come to you, and knowing exactly what you are going to say when it does. Chapter 6. The word came to John in the wilderness. Luke is a careful writer. He was a physician by training, a Gentile who had become a follower of Jesus. And when he sat down to write his account of the story he had investigated thoroughly, he made choices that reflect a precise historical and theological intelligence. The 3rd chapter of his Gospel opens with a list. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, and Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. 6 names, 6 centers of power: the emperor in Rome, the governor in Jerusalem, 2 regional rulers, and the 2 men who controlled the religious establishment of the most important city in the Jewish world. Luke is establishing, with a historian's precision, exactly where all the power is located. And then the next line, the word of God came to John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Not to Tiberius, not to Pilate, not to Herod or Philip or Lysanias, not to Annas or Caiaphas, who between them controlled the temple, the high priesthood, and the entire machinery of official Jewish religious life. The word came to John in the wilderness. Anyone who had read the Hebrew scriptures would have recognized this pattern immediately. The word of the Lord came to Elijah. The word of the Lord came to Jonah. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. In every case, the word went where it went, not where the structure of power suggested it should go. Samuel heard the voice of God when he was a boy sleeping in the temple, at a time when the text says the word of the Lord was rare. Amos was a shepherd and a dresser of sycamore trees when he was called. The prophetic tradition had always operated outside the official structures. The official structures, the kings and the priests and the professional court prophets who told those kings what they wanted to hear, consistently got the word wrong. The outsiders, the ones with no stake in the current arrangement, the ones who had nothing to protect. Those were the ones who heard it clearly. Luke knew this. His opening list of power was not throat-clearing before the real content. It was the frame that made the content visible. Here is where all the power is. And here is where the word went. It went to the wilderness. John came out of the desert and went to the Jordan River. The geography matters, and Luke intends it to matter. The Jordan was not just the nearest large body of water. It was the most symbolically loaded river in the entire Jewish imagination. Israel had crossed it under Joshua to enter the Promised Land for the first time. The waters stopping just as the Red Sea had stopped 40 years earlier under Moses. Elijah had struck the Jordan with his cloak and crossed it on dry ground before being taken up in the whirlwind. Elisha had struck it again and crossed back. Naaman, the Syrian, had washed in it 7 times and been healed of his leprosy. When John stood at the Jordan and called people to come and be baptized, he was standing in one of the most memory-saturated locations in his people's history. Every person who walked into that water carried with them the weight of everything that water meant. Entry and exodus, covenant and cleansing, leaving and returning. And what he was calling them to do in that water was not a new ritual. Jewish ceremonial washing was ancient and familiar. The temple had ritual baths. The Qumran community practiced regular immersion. Proselytes, Gentiles converting to Judaism, were required to immerse themselves as part of the conversion process. What John was doing was something different in a way that was immediately clear to anyone who understood the existing system. He was calling Jewish people to a baptism of repentance, not Gentiles converting, not ritual purification before temple service. Yos, children of Abraham, the people who had the law and the temple and the covenant and the whole history of God's faithfulness to their ancestors, he was telling them that their membership in the right family was not sufficient. That being Abraham's descendants was not the same as being prepared for what was coming. That the Jordan, which their ancestors had crossed to enter the land of promise, needed to be crossed again, in the other direction first, as an act of honesty about the gap between who they were supposed to be and who they actually were. This was not a comfortable message. It implied that something was wrong at a level that heredity and religious observance could not fix. It implied that the whole system, the temple and the priesthood and the meticulous keeping of the law, had not produced the thing it was supposed to produce. Not because the system was entirely wrong, but because the people operating within it had mistaken the map for the territory. The message hit the region like a stone hitting water. People came, first in small numbers. Probably. Word of mouth works slowly at first and then all at once. A man out by the Jordan. No credentials. No institutional backing. Dressed like Elijah, looked in the old stories. But something about what he was saying was landing in a way that the sermons in the synagogues were not. John was not offering a new program. He was not giving people a better set of religious techniques. He was saying something much simpler and much harder you need to turn around. That word, repentance, has been so thoroughly domesticated by centuries of religious usage that it takes effort to hear what it sounded like when John said it. In Greek it is metanoia, a complete change of mind and direction. Not feeling bad about specific sins and trying harder next time, a fundamental reorientation of the whole person, turning from one direction to face another. It is the kind of word that either lands like nothing or lands like everything, depending on the condition of the person hearing it. In the Judea of the first century, after 400 years of silence and decades of Roman occupation and a temple establishment that had made its peace with Caesar, there were a great many people for whom the word landed like everything. They came out of their villages and their towns. They came down the roads from Jerusalem. They came across the river from Perea. And they went into the water. The crowds kept coming. And underneath all the specific questions about what to do and how to live and what the baptism meant, there was one question that everyone was really asking. The question that had been building for 400 years. Is this the one? John knew the question was there. He had been living with it his whole life. The child whose father had sung over him about the spirit and power of Elijah, the one who would go before the Lord to prepare his ways. He knew what the crowds were wondering when they looked at him. He knew that the messianic expectation was real and present and ready to attach itself to the first person who seemed to fit the pattern. And he knew, with a clarity that would define everything about his public ministry, exactly what he was and exactly what he was not. How he handled that knowledge, and the specific encounter that forced it into the open, is one of the most revealing things about who John actually was. Chapter 7. What the wilderness preacher actually said, and why the whole country came to hear it. Before we go any further, we need to slow down and spend real time with what John actually said. Because there is a version of John the Baptist that gets handed down through centuries of retelling. And it is not entirely wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. In that version, John is a dramatic figure in rough clothing who stands in the water and points at Jesus and says, "Behold the Lamb of God." He is a forerunner, a pointer, a warm-up act. His significance is entirely borrowed from the one he announces. That version misses something important. John had a message, a specific, detailed, theologically serious message that addressed real conditions in a real society with real precision. It was not just repent because someone important is coming. It was a diagnosis of what was wrong and a set of instructions for what to do about it. And the fact that John delivered this message to crowds of ordinary people along a river outside the official structures of religious authority, and that those people kept coming, tells you something about how badly they needed to hear exactly this. Mark writes it with the bluntness that is his habit. And all the country of Judea and all Jerusalem were going out to him and were being baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. All the country of Judea, all Jerusalem. The Jordan River is not close to Jerusalem. It is a journey from the city, down the hills, through the wilderness, to the valley floor where the river runs between its banks lined with tamarisk trees. It was not a casual afternoon trip. People who made that journey had decided to make it, had packed for it, had told their families where they were going, had arranged their lives to accommodate the travel. And they went in numbers large enough that the ancient sources, both inside the New Testament and outside it, treat the phenomenon as one of the significant social events of the period. Josephus, the Jewish historian who wrote in the late 1st century, mentions John in a passage, remarkable, precisely because Josephus was not a follower of Jesus and had no theological interest in making John sound important. He writes that John was a good man who commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism. And he writes that Herod feared John because the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, as they seemed ready to do anything he should advise. Two things stand out in Josephus's account. First, he does not frame John's appeal as primarily theological. He describes it in terms of virtue and righteousness, categories that would have been legible to his Greco-Roman readership. John was calling people to be better toward each other and toward God. That message, stripped of its specifically Jewish prophetic context, was recognizable across cultures as a serious moral project. Second, and more important for understanding the political stakes, Herod was afraid of John's influence, not because of what John was saying, but because of what the people around John seemed ready to do. The crowd following John was a crowd that had been mobilized, that had demonstrated its willingness to act on what it heard. Herod was calculating, correctly, that a crowd capable of walking out into the wilderness to hear a prophet and stand in a river was a crowd that might do other things if that prophet pointed them in a particular direction. A man with no army was more dangerous than a man with one, because you cannot fight an idea with soldiers. Now look at what John was actually saying to the people who came to him. Because the crowds that arrived at the Jordan were not a homogeneous group. Tax collectors came, soldiers came, Pharisees and Sadducees came, people from Jerusalem and all the surrounding region came. These groups did not ordinarily share the same space in any comfortable way. Tax collectors were collaborators with Rome in the eyes of most observant Jews. Men who had purchased the right to collect taxes in their district and who made their profit by charging more than Rome required. They were not just economically exploitative. They were socially contaminated by their constant contact with Gentiles and Roman systems. They sat at the very bottom of the Jewish social hierarchy in terms of religious respectability. Soldiers had power and they used it, and the forms of abuse most common to soldiers in occupied territory. Demanding food and shelter without payment, extorting money in exchange for protection, using violence as a management tool, were all present and all despised. And yet all of these people were coming to the same river and standing in the same water and asking the same man the same question, "What should we do?" John's answers to that question are among the most practically useful things in the entire New Testament. To the crowds in general, whoever has 2 tunics should share with the person who has none. Whoever has food should do the same. This is not a program for systemic economic reform. It is a direct, immediate instruction for how a person with resources responds to a person without them. You have 2. Someone near you has none. Give 1. The gap between a theology of generosity and an act of generosity is often exactly this small. And John collapsed it without ceremony. To the tax collectors, collect no more than you are authorized to collect. Do not skim. Do not inflate. Take what is legally required and nothing more. This is remarkable because John did not tell the tax collectors to quit their jobs. He did not tell them to repent of having taken the positions in the first place. He gave them a path forward inside their current situation. You are a tax collector. Fine. Then be an honest one. That is what repentance looks like in your specific circumstances. To the soldiers, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation. Be content with your wages. Again, John did not tell them to leave the army. He told them to be soldiers without abusing the power that comes with being a soldier. Stop using your authority to take what is not yours. Do your job without weaponizing it against the people you are supposed to be protecting. These instructions share a common logic. They are all about not using whatever power or position you occupy to extract more than you are entitled to from the people who are more vulnerable than you. The person with 2 coats has more than the person with none. The tax collector has the power of Rome behind his collection authority. The soldier has the power of physical force and legal immunity. John was saying to all of them, the fact that you can take more does not mean you should. And the practice of not taking more is not separate from your religious life. It is your religious life. This is where John becomes genuinely dangerous to the established order, and not in the way that a firebrand revolutionary is dangerous. John was not calling for the overthrow of Rome, or the abolition of the tax system, or the disbanding of Herod's army. He was calling for something more subversive than any of that. He was calling for people to be honest inside the systems they already inhabited, which would have made those systems function very differently than they did. A tax collector who only took what he was authorized to take was not enriching himself or his superiors through the usual mechanisms. A soldier who did not extort was not generating the informal revenue that made the occupation economically sustainable at the local level. John was not proposing a revolution. He was proposing integrity. And integrity, practiced consistently by enough people, disrupts established systems more thoroughly than most revolutions do. Now look at what John said to the Pharisees and Sadducees when they came to the Jordan. He called them a brood of vipers. That phrase has become so familiar that we no longer feel its edge. But imagine being a Pharisee in first-century Judea, a man who had given his life to the rigorous study and practice of the Torah, who fasted twice a week and tithed even his garden herbs, who had organized his entire existence around the conviction that meticulous religious observance was the way to honor God and maintain the covenant. And having someone call you a snake. John was not being dramatic for effect. He was being diagnostic. Who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? That is what he asked them. The implication was clear. You are here because you heard about the wrath that is coming, and you want to get ahead of it. You want to be on the right side of whatever this is. But you are not here because you have actually looked at your lives and found them wanting. You are here because you are trying to manage your position. Do not presume to say to yourselves, "We have Abraham as our father." For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. That sentence was explosive in that context. The entire framework of Jewish religious identity rested on the covenant God had made with Abraham, renewed with Isaac and Jacob, formalized at Sinai. Being a child of Abraham was not just an ethnic marker. It was a theological status, a guarantee of inclusion in the covenant people, a position of standing before God that was inherited by birth and maintained by practice. And John was saying that this inheritance, which they had never done anything to earn and which they had always assumed was permanent and protective, was not what they thought it was. God can make children of Abraham out of stones. Your heredity does not protect you. Your lineage does not protect you. The question is not who your father was. The question is what fruit your tree is bearing right now. The axe is already at the root of the trees. He said, "Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire." That is not gentle language, and it was not meant to be. But notice what John did not say. He did not say you are too far gone. Leave. Do not come back. He said bear fruit in keeping with repentance. The same instruction he gave the tax collectors and the soldiers. You are here. Good. Now let what happens here actually change what happens when you leave. The crowds that kept coming were coming because John was offering something the temple system was not offering: an encounter with honesty. The baptism he performed was not absolution. It was not a declaration that the sins being confessed were now forgiven and forgotten. It was a visible, public, bodily act of acknowledgement. You went into the water knowing what you were. You came out of the water still knowing what you were, but having said it out loud, having let it be real in a way that interior guilt does not force you to let it be real. People do not primarily want to be told they are fine. They want to be told the truth and then given a reason to believe that the truth does not have to be the final word. John gave them the truth. He also gave them the reason. I baptize you with water for repentance. He told them, but he who is coming after me is mightier than I, whose sandals I am not worthy to carry. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. His winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn. But the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. The image he chose is agricultural and precise. A threshing floor is where grain is separated from chaff after the harvest. The grain and the chaff are mixed together on the floor, and you drive the oxen over it. And then you take a large wooden fork and throw the mixture into the air. The wind carries the chaff away. The grain falls back to the floor. Then you gather the grain. John was describing a judgment, not a punishment imposed from outside on people who had committed specific crimes. A separation, a revealing of what was already there. The grain and the chaff look the same from a distance. The winnowing does not change what they are. It shows what they already are. This is how John understood the one who was coming. As a separator, someone whose presence would reveal, with complete clarity, what was real and what was not. And John understood his own role in relation to that. He was preparing the threshing floor for the one who would use the fork. He was making the separation possible by calling people to honesty about themselves before the one who could see them completely arrived. That is why the specific instructions mattered so much. Give away the extra coat. Stop skimming. Stop extorting. These were not moral improvements for their own sake. They were acts of alignment with what was true. Ways of arranging your life so that when the one John was describing arrived, You would not be caught completely off guard by what he could see. Something was waking up in the Judean countryside. Something that had been dormant for a long time was beginning to stir. And the people who were most awake to it had one question underneath all the other questions. The question that had been building for 400 years. The question that every new prophet and every new movement since Malachi had been forced to answer. Is this the one? John knew the question was there. He knew what the crowds were wondering when they looked at him. He knew that the messianic expectation was real and present and ready to attach itself to the first person who seemed to fit the pattern. And he knew, with a clarity that would define everything about his public ministry, that he was not that person. How he handled that knock, and the specific encounter that forced it into the open, is one of the most revealing things about who John actually was. He told anyone who would listen, "The one who is coming after me," he said, "the one whose sandal strap I am not worthy to untie." With John, it was the strangest thing a person with a following can do, and the most honest. Chapter 8. I am not the Christ. The 3 times John said no. The delegation arrived from Jerusalem with the full weight of institutional authority behind it. These were not curious individuals who had heard about the man at the Jordan and made the trip on their own initiative. The Gospel of John tells us they were priests and Levites, sent by the Pharisees. This was an official inquiry, organized by the most influential religious party in Judea, staffed by men who represented the establishment that controlled the temple and the synagogues and the interpretation of the law. They came with credentials. They came with the implicit authority of Jerusalem behind every question they asked. And they asked the question that everyone had been circling for months. Who are you? 3 words. Simple on the surface. But underneath them was the entire weight of 400 years of messianic expectation. The accumulated pressure of a people who had been waiting so long that the waiting had become part of their identity. Who are you? Meant, are you the one? Are you the answer to what Malachi promised? Are you the reason the silence finally broke? John answered directly. He did not evade or deflect or offer a careful statement that left room for interpretation. The Gospel of John says he confessed and did not deny, but confessed. The repetition is deliberate. He said plainly, I am not the Christ. The delegation regrouped and tried again. What then? Are you Elijah? This was not an arbitrary question. Malachi had said Elijah would come before the great and terrible day of the Lord. There was a tradition, alive and active in first-century Judaism, that Elijah had not died but had been taken up into heaven and would return at the appointed time. If John was not the Messiah, maybe he was the returned Elijah, the forerunner Malachi had promised, the one who would announce the Messiah's arrival. John said, I am not. The delegation tried once more. Are you the prophet? This referred to a specific expectation drawn from Deuteronomy, where Moses told the people that God would raise up a prophet like himself from among them, a new Moses figure who would bring the definitive word from God. Some people in that era held this expectation separately from the messianic hope. They were looking for a prophet in the line of Moses, someone who would deliver a new Torah, a new revelation. John said no. 3 questions, 3 answers, and each answer was shorter than the one before it. I am not the Christ. I am not Elijah. No. The progression has the feeling of a man who has thought carefully about exactly where the lines are and is not going to let the pressure of the moment move him across any of them. The delegation was frustrated. They had been sent to find out who this man was, and they were coming up empty. So they pressed him, who are you? We need to give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? And John quoted Isaiah. I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. This answer deserves to live with for a while, because it is one of the most carefully chosen self-descriptions in the entire New Testament. John did not say, I am John the son of Zacharias, a prophet of the Most High, sent by God to prepare the way for the Messiah. He could have said something like that. It would have been accurate. It would have given the delegation something to work with. Instead, he identified himself with a fragment of a sentence from Isaiah 40. Not the whole sentence. Not even the whole image. Just the voice. The voice crying in the wilderness. A voice is the most impersonal possible form of self-description. A voice does not have a face. A voice does not have a history or a lineage or a career or a position in any hierarchy. A voice is entirely defined by what it says and by whose word it carries. The moment the voice stops speaking, it is nothing. There is no voice without the word being spoken. And the word being spoken is not the voice's own word. John was defining himself as something that existed only in relation to something else. The voice exists for the word. The word is not the voice's. The voice has no independent existence, no purpose of its own, no significance outside of carrying what it has been given to carry. This is the most radical statement of relational identity in the Gospels, and it came not from Jesus but from John, about himself. In response to a direct question from official representatives of the religious establishment, the delegation was still not satisfied. They pushed back. Then why are you baptizing? If you are not the Christ or Elijah or the prophet, where does your authority come from? John answered, I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know, even he who comes after me, the strap of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. Among you stands one you do not know. That sentence is extraordinary in the context of this interrogation. The delegation had come from Jerusalem, representing the people who are most invested in knowing. The Pharisees were the most meticulous students of the law in the Jewish world. The priests and Levites had dedicated their lives to the service of God in the temple. If anyone could be expected to recognize the one they had been waiting for, it should have been these men. And John told them he is already here, and you do not know him. The humility in John's answer is real, but it is not self-deprecating in a weak sense. When he says he is not worthy to untie the sandal of the one coming after him, he is not performing modesty. He is making a precise theological statement. In the rabbinic tradition of the period, a student might perform many personal services for his teacher as an expression of devotion and honor. But untying sandals was considered too menial even for a disciple. That task was for household slaves. John was saying, I am not even in the category of slave relative to the one who is coming. This is a man who had spent 30 years in the desert, thinking carefully about who he was and who he was not. The precision of his answer to the delegation was not improvised in the moment. It was the product of decades of clarity, worked out in the silence of the Judean wilderness, tested against the scriptures, refined until only what was true remained. The next day, according to the Gospel of John, Jesus came to the river, and everything John had been preparing for arrived. The delegation from Jerusalem would have to take their report back to the Pharisees and explain that the man at the Jordan refused to be anyone important. He said he was just a voice. They would have to explain that the voice kept pointing at someone else, someone already present among the people, someone they had not identified. What they made of that report, we do not know. What we know is what happened at the river the following day. And what happened at the river the following day is the moment that the entire first half of John's life had been moving toward. The moment that would define everything that came after, including the darkness of a prison cell above the Dead Sea and the question that darkness would eventually force out of him. Chapter 9. The moment at the Jordan. Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. Matthew records John's response to seeing him, I need to be baptized by you. And do you come to me? That sentence carries years of knowledge in it. This was not the response of a man meeting a stranger. This was not professional politeness between two religious figures who had heard of each other. This was recognition, the kind that comes from a history we can only partially reconstruct. John and Jesus were relatives. Luke establishes this in the first chapter of his Gospel. When Gabriel tells Mary that her relative Elizabeth has also conceived, The Greek word Luke uses suggests a broader family connection rather than a specific degree of kinship. They were family, in a world where family meant something dense and ongoing, where relatives knew each other's stories, where the significant events of one household were known and discussed in the households connected to it. John had been in the wilderness for roughly 30 years. We do not know if he and Jesus maintained contact during those years or if the separation was as complete as the geographical distance suggests. But John knew who Jesus was. And when Jesus arrived at the Jordan, John's immediate response was not the practiced deference of a religious figure managing a delicate public moment. It was the honest reaction of a person who understood the situation clearly. "You should be baptizing me. Why are you here to be baptized?" The question John asked is the question that the early church wrestled with for generations, and in some ways is still wrestling with. If baptism was a baptism of repentance, and if Jesus was who John understood him to be, then what was Jesus doing in that water? What did he need to repent of? What was he confessing when he went under? Jesus answered simply, "Let it be so now. For thus it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness." That phrase, "fulfill all righteousness," is characteristically dense. Matthew does not unpack it, and the scholars who have tried to unpack it for 2,000 years have not arrived at a single settled interpretation. But the most straightforward reading is this: Jesus was not being baptized because he needed what the baptism was for. He was being baptized because identifying completely with the people he had come to serve required going where they were going, doing what they were doing, standing in the same water they stood in, going under the same current they went under. He was not confessing sin. He was joining a people in the act of honest acknowledgement that is the first step towards something new. John consented, and Jesus went into the water. What happened next is described by all three of the Gospels that include it, and the descriptions are consistent enough across their differences to suggest that the witnesses were reporting something they actually experienced rather than something they constructed later for theological effect. When Jesus came up out of the water, the heavens were opened. The Spirit of God descended like a dove and came to rest on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." The heavens opened. That phrase appears in the Hebrew prophets as a description of divine action, of a moment when the barrier between ordinary human experience and the realm of God becomes permeable. Ezekiel saw the heavens opened and received his visions. The imagery carries the sense of something normally closed becoming accessible, of a channel that is usually sealed being opened for a specific purpose. The dove is a more complex image. In the Jewish tradition, the dove carried associations with the Spirit of God moving over the waters at creation. The Talmud would later describe the Spirit brooding over the waters like a dove. But the Gospels are precise. The Spirit descended like a dove, not as a dove, like one. The comparison is to the movement, the gentleness of the descent, the settling quality of a bird coming to rest. Something came down and landed on Jesus and stayed. And then the voice. In the rabbinic tradition of the period, there was a concept called the bat kol, which means daughter of a voice, a kind of secondary revelation, an echo of the divine voice, something less direct than prophecy, but more than ordinary speech. This moment at the Jordan was understood by the people present as something on that order, a word from outside ordinary human experience breaking into a specific moment. The voice said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." John heard that. John saw the dove descend. John was the one standing there when the heavens opened. This is the man who would later send messengers from prison to ask, "Are you the one who is to come? Or shall we look for another?" Hold that tension. We are going to need to hold it all the way to chapter 13, where it becomes the most important question in the story. But it needs to be planted here. In this moment, when the evidence was as clear as evidence gets, John saw the heavens open. He heard the voice. He watched the Spirit descend. And the Gospel of John records what he said afterward to the people around him. I saw the Spirit descend from heaven like a dove, and it remained on him. I myself did not know him, but he who sent me to baptize with water said to me, He on whom you see the Spirit descend and remain, this is he who baptizes with the Holy Spirit. And I have seen and have borne witness that this is the Son of God. I have seen, I have borne witness. That is John speaking in the past tense, reflecting on what happened, telling people what he saw so they would understand what it meant. He was a witness to what happened at the Jordan in the fullest sense of the word. A person who had been present, who had observed, and who was taking responsibility for reporting what he observed accurately. He had seen it, and he told everyone. The day after the baptism, John was standing with two of his disciples when Jesus walked by. John looked at him and said, Behold, the Lamb of God. That phrase comes from a deep well in the Jewish tradition. The Passover lamb, whose blood on the doorposts of the Israelite homes in Egypt had been the sign that protected them from the angel of death. The daily temple sacrifice. 2 lambs, morning and evening. The continuous offering that marked every day of the temple calendar. The suffering servant of Isaiah 53, who is led like a lamb to the slaughter, who opens not his mouth, who bears the sin of many. John did not explain what he meant. He pointed. Behold, 2 of his disciples, hearing him say this, left John and followed Jesus. This is the moment that every teacher and every leader and every person who has built something with other people eventually faces. The moment when the people who have been following you start following someone else. Most people, if they are honest, feel something complicated in that moment, even if they understand it intellectually, even if they have been preparing people for it, even if they believe wholeheartedly in what the people are moving toward. There is something in the human experience of being left that does not respond entirely to reasoning. John had 2 of his disciples walk away from him and toward Jesus, and he had pointed them there himself. What he felt about that, we are not told. What he did about it tells us something. He kept pointing the next day, and the day after that, and in the weeks and months that followed, John continued his ministry at the Jordan. Jesus went north to Galilee and began gathering his own followers. 2 movements were operating simultaneously, drawing from the same pool of expectation that 400 years of waiting had created. And then the Pharisees heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. Someone reported this to John's disciples, and they came to him with the information in the way that anxious followers always bring competitive information to their leaders, hoping for a response that will settle the anxiety. John's response was waiting for them, and it is the subject of the next chapter. Chapter 10. He must increase, I must decrease. The disciples came to John with worry written on their faces. Rabbi, they said, the one you testified about across the Jordan, the one you pointed everyone toward. He is baptizing now, and everyone is going to him. That report came loaded with implication. The crowds that had been filling the banks of the Jordan, the movement John had built through years of desert preparation and public ministry, the people who had walked for days to hear him speak and confess their sins in the river. They were transferring their attention. The numbers were shifting, and John's disciples were watching it happen and coming to their teacher the way followers always come. John answered them with a parable and then with one of the most theologically precise statements he ever made. A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease. He must increase, I must decrease. Those 5 words are often quoted as a beautiful expression of humility, and they are that. But they are also more than that. They are a theological statement about the structure of the moment John was living in. He understood that there was a right order to things, that the forerunner was not supposed to remain in the spotlight after the one he announced had arrived, that his job was not to compete with Jesus for followers, but to point people toward Jesus and then get out of the way. The bridegroom image is worth staying with. In first-century Jewish wedding custom, the friend of the bridegroom had a specific role. He was the one who made the arrangements, who brought the two parties together, who facilitated the union. And on the wedding night, the friend of the bridegroom stood outside the wedding chamber and listened for the bridegroom's voice as confirmation that the marriage had been consummated. When he heard it, the friend rejoiced. The friend of the bridegroom did not try to be the bridegroom. His role was entirely defined by service to someone else's union. His joy was not at his own success. His joy was at hearing the voice of the one the whole arrangement was for. This is how John understood his own ministry at this moment. He had made the arrangements. He had prepared the way. He had called people to the river and into the water and pointed them at the one who was coming. And now that one had arrived, and people were going to him, and that was not a loss for John. That was the confirmation that everything John had worked toward had worked. This joy of mine is now complete. There is something in that sentence that requires honesty to stay with. The joy John describes is not the joy of someone who has won something or arrived somewhere comfortable. It is the joy of someone whose purpose has been fulfilled, which is a very specific and sometimes very lonely kind of joy. When the thing you have given your life to is complete, when the work you were sent to do is done, you do not always feel what you expected to feel. John was describing the completion of his purpose at the moment when, from the outside, it looked like his movement was shrinking and someone else's was growing. He was saying, I know what this looks like to you. It looks like loss. It is not loss. It is exactly what was supposed to happen. He must increase. I must decrease. The Greek verb for decrease means to become less, to diminish, to be reduced in size or significance. John was saying that his own diminishment was not a failure. It was the sign that he had succeeded. The forerunner's job is complete when the one he announced is fully present, and the completion of the job means the job is over. This is genuinely rare in human experience. Leaders do not typically rejoice when their movements transfer their loyalty elsewhere. Teachers do not instinctively celebrate when their students surpass them and draw the crowds that used to come to them. The normal human response to being left behind, even when you understand intellectually that it is the right thing, is more complicated than pure joy. John said, this joy of mine is now complete. Whether joy was the only emotion present, whether there was grief or loneliness mixed in with the completeness, the text does not tell us. What the text tells us is what he said. And what he said was, this is exactly what was supposed to happen. And the happening of it is a reason for joy. That posture, that orientation toward his own diminishment as fulfillment rather than loss, was about to be tested under conditions that made the question of joy and grief far less theoretical. The test came in the form of a man named Herod, a woman named Herodias, and a truth that John could see clearly and could not bring himself to leave unsaid. But before we get there, notice something that the Gospel of John places immediately after this passage. John says he must increase and I must decrease. And then the Gospel of John immediately transitions to a long theological reflection that includes one of the most famous verses in the New Testament. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Scholars have debated for centuries whether those words are still John the Baptist speaking, or whether the Gospel writer has taken over. The Greek does not resolve it clearly, but the placement is intentional. Immediately after John says he must decrease and someone else must increase, the text gives us the most concentrated statement of why the increasing matters. The one John had been pointing toward was not simply a greater prophet or a more powerful teacher. He was, according to this text, God's own answer to the most fundamental problem in human experience. John understood something of this. He had preached judgment and grace, and the one who was coming with the winnowing fork. He had pointed at Jesus and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God," and watched his own disciples walk away to follow someone else. And he had called it joy. He must increase. I must decrease. That sentence is the summary of John's entire ministry. Every word he ever spoke, every person he ever baptized, every line he ever drew and held in the face of pressure, was oriented toward making that decrease possible. He was building something he would not inhabit. He was preparing a road he would not walk all the way down. The full weight of what that cost him would not become visible for a while yet. It would become visible in a prison cell above the Dead Sea, in the dark, in the silence between sending a question out and waiting for an answer to come back. But first, there was one more thing John had to say in public, one more line to draw, one more truth to speak to a person who had the power to make the speaking very costly. He could not leave it unsaid. He never could. Chapter 11, It Is Not Lawful. The one line that cost everything. Herod Antipas was a man who had learned to survive by being careful. His father, Herod the Great, had been one of the most politically skillful rulers in the ancient Near East. A man who had maintained his position through 4 decades of Roman civil war by the simple strategy of always backing the winning side, or switching sides quickly enough when the winning side changed. He had built the temple in Jerusalem into one of the wonders of the ancient world. He had also murdered several of his own sons when he suspected them of plotting against him. He was, by any measure, a man who understood power and what it required. Antipas inherited a smaller version of his father's domain, the territories of Galilee and Perea, and he inherited none of his father's political brilliance. What he had was a careful man's instinct for not doing anything that could not be undone, for managing threats before they became crises, for staying inside the boundaries that Rome had drawn around his authority. He had one significant weakness. His name was not really Herod. Herod was the family name, carried by multiple members of the dynasty. His actual name was Antipas. But the weakness was not his name. The weakness was Herodias. Herodias was the granddaughter of Herod the Great. She had been married to one of Antipas's half-brothers, a man named Philip, who lived as a private citizen in Rome. Not a ruler, not politically significant, just a member of the extended Herodian family living quietly on his inheritance. They had a daughter together named Salome. At some point, Antipas visited Rome. The details are sketchy in the way that details of ancient royal family arrangements always are. What is clear is that during or after that visit, Antipas and Herodias began an affair and made arrangements to marry. This required Herodias to leave Philip and required Antipas to divorce his current wife, the daughter of Aretas IV, the Nabatean king whose territory bordered Perea to the south. The divorce was politically dangerous. Aretas was not going to accept the humiliation of his daughter being sent home so that Antipas could marry another man's wife, and he did not accept it. The conflict between Herod Antipas and Aretas IV would eventually produce a war in which Antipas's army was decisively defeated, a defeat that Josephus records as widely interpreted by the Jewish people as divine punishment for what Antipas had done to John the Baptist. But that came later. At the moment when John first encountered the situation, the marriage between Antipas and Herodias was being arranged or had recently been completed. Herodias had left Philip. Antipas had divorced the Nabatean princess. And John said publicly, to whoever would listen and to Herod himself, according to the gospel accounts, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." One sentence. To understand why John could not leave that sentence unsaid, you need to understand what the violation actually was. The Mosaic Law, in Leviticus 18, prohibited a man from marrying his brother's wife. The rabbinical tradition had worked through the details of this prohibition carefully, and the consensus was clear. You could not marry your living brother's wife. The Levirate marriage tradition, which required a man to marry his deceased brother's widow if the brother had left no children, was a specific exception for specific circumstances. Antipas's situation met none of the conditions for that exception. Philip was alive. They had a daughter together. The marriage was, in the plain reading of the law that every observant Jew in Galilee and Perea knew, illegal, not just morally problematic, legally prohibited by the Torah. And Antipas was the ruler of the territory where the Torah was supposed to govern. John did not invent this problem or import it from outside. He named something that was visibly, publicly, undeniably present. The ruler of the Jewish territory of Galilee and Perea had married his living brother's wife in violation of the law that defined what it meant to be a Jewish ruler of a Jewish territory. That was the fact. And John had spent his entire adult life being the kind of person who said what was true regardless of what saying it cost him. The cost this time was going to be very high. But let us stay for a moment with the question of why he could not be silent. Because the answer is not simply that John was constitutionally incapable of political prudence. He was not reckless. The way he handled the interrogation from the Jerusalem delegation showed a man who thought precisely about what he was saying and what he was not saying. He was not someone who spoke without thinking. He spoke about Herod's marriage because he had thought about it and concluded that silence was not an option available to him. The prophetic tradition he had inherited was unambiguous about this. Nathan had gone to David and said, "You are the man." Elijah had gone to Ahab and said, "You have troubled Israel." Jeremiah had stood in the temple court and told the priests and the people that the temple they trusted in would be destroyed if they did not change their ways. The prophets of Israel had always had a specific responsibility toward the rulers of Israel, a responsibility that went beyond private advice to public accountability. If the king violated the law, the prophet said so, publicly, regardless of the consequences. John was not just a preacher of individual repentance. He was standing in the line of people who had been saying hard things to power since the days of Samuel. And the hard thing that needed to be said in his moment was not about the spiritual condition of the common people. It was about the man in the palace. "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." Antipas had John arrested and put in prison. Mark tells us something important about the dynamic that followed. He writes that Herodias had a grudge against John and wanted to put him to death. But she could not, because Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he kept him safe. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he heard him gladly. This is one of the most psychologically precise portraits in the entire New Testament. Antipas was caught between two things that should not have been able to coexist in the same person, but that coexist in people all the time. He feared John. He recognized something in John that was real and weighty and not easily dismissed. He heard him gladly, which is a remarkable thing to say about a man you have imprisoned. He was perplexed, deeply unsettled, by what John said, but he kept going back to hear more. Herodias had no such ambivalence. She wanted John dead, and the reason is not hard to understand. John's continued existence was a public declaration that her marriage was illegitimate. Every time he opened his mouth, every report that circulated through Galilee and Perea about what the prophet at the Jordan had said about the king's marriage was a reminder to everyone in the territory that the woman sitting beside Antipas was sitting there in violation of the law. She had staked her position, her security, her future on this marriage, and John was the most prominent voice in the region calling it what it was. She wanted him silenced permanently. Antipas kept him alive. That tension, Herodias pushing for death and Antipas holding back, is the environment in which John spent his imprisonment, protected by the curious fascination of a weak man who could not quite bring himself to fully reject what he heard, even when what he heard was a direct challenge to his choices. John was taken to the fortress of Machaerus. That location matters in a way that is easy to miss if you do not know the geography. Machaerus was a fortified palace built by Herod the Great on a ridge in Perea, the territory east of the Dead Sea. It sat on top of a hill above deep ravines on three sides, an almost impregnable position with commanding views across the Dead Sea toward Jerusalem. From the heights of Machaerus, on a clear day you could see the hills of Judea across the water. The hills where John had grown up, the hills of the city whose religious establishment had sent delegations to ask who he was. John was not in some anonymous dungeon somewhere. He was in a place where the landscape of his whole story was visible from the walls. He could see, if he looked west across the water, the hills where the temple stood, the institution he had never served in, never accepted the authority of, never sought the approval of, was visible across the Dead Sea from his cell. He could see the Jordan Valley to the north, where the river ran through the desert, where he had spent 30 years and then stood in the water and watched the heavens open. And from that landscape, reports began coming to him about what Jesus was doing. The reports were good, extraordinary. In fact, the sick were being healed, the lame were walking, the dead were being raised, the poor were hearing good news. Everything that Isaiah had said the age of the Lord would look like. The passages John knew as well as he knew his own name was apparently happening, and John was in a cell. He had done his part. He had gone into the desert and prepared himself. He had come out and prepared the nation. He had baptized the one he was sent to prepare for, had seen the heavens open and the Spirit descend, and had heard the voice from heaven. He had pointed his own disciples toward Jesus, had accepted his own diminishment, had declared publicly that he was not the Christ and would not be the Christ, and was glad to be something much smaller. And he was in a cell. The one he had given everything to prepare for was out there healing and teaching and gathering crowds. And John was in a cell. Something was building in him that would eventually find its way into a question. That question is the one this whole story has been building toward. Chapter 12. Machaerus. What the dark does. There is a cliff above the eastern shore of the Dead Sea. It rises out of the desert in a way that seems almost architectural, a natural formation that looks as if it was designed to be built on, sheer on three sides, connected to the higher ground behind it by a narrow ridge. The Dead Sea lies 5 miles to the west, flat and silver-gray in the haze, the lowest point on the surface of the earth. On clear days, the hills of Judea are visible across the water, a blue-brown line on the western horizon. Herod the Great built a palace fortress on that cliff, Machaerus. The name may come from a Greek word for sword or sickle, a reference to the curved shape of the ridge. It was part of a network of fortified positions that Herod maintained throughout his territory, places of military strength that could serve as refuges if things went wrong in the cities. By the time John was imprisoned there, it was Antipas's property. He used it as a palace as well as a fortress, which is why the account of Salome's dance and John's execution is set there. The same building that held dangerous prisoners in the cells cut into the rock below could host a banquet in the halls above. John was below. We do not know precisely what his conditions were. The ancient sources do not give us a description of the cell. What we know is that it was a real imprisonment, not house arrest or comfortable confinement. Josephus describes it simply as imprisonment. The Gospel of Mark describes his disciples having access to him, able to bring him word and receive his messages, which suggests he was not in complete isolation. But it was confinement. It was restricted. It was the opposite of everything his adult life had been. John had spent 30 years in the open wilderness, where the sky was his ceiling and the desert was his floor and the Jordan River was his stage. He had moved freely through the territory east of Jerusalem, accessible to whoever came to him, accountable to no human authority. He had answered questions from thousands of people. He had set the terms of every conversation he was part of. Now someone else set the terms. In the Hebrew prophetic tradition, imprisonment was not an uncommon experience for the people who said uncomfortable things to power. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern. Micaiah was imprisoned by King Ahab. The prophets who challenged kings did so knowing that kings had dungeons and were not reluctant to use them. John knew his own tradition. He would have known these stories. He would have understood, in the abstract, that this was always one of the possible outcomes of his work. Understanding something in the abstract is not the same as living it. The months in Machaerus were a different kind of formation than the 30 years in the desert had been. The desert was chosen. The wilderness was his decision, his address. The environment he had selected, because it was the right environment for the work he had been given to do. The cell at Machaerus was not chosen. It was imposed. And there is a fundamental difference between the silence you embrace and the silence that is forced on you. In the desert, the silence had been productive. It was the silence in which a man becomes what he needs to become, in which a message is refined until only what is essential remains. The desert silence was purposeful. It was going somewhere. The cell at Machaerus was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of waiting without knowing what you are waiting for, of hearing reports from outside about things happening that you are not part of having given your best and your most to a purpose and finding yourself not at a moment of culmination, but in a room where nothing is happening. This kind of silence does something to a person. It asks questions that the productive silence of the desert never asked. When you are in the desert by choice, building yourself toward a purpose, the silence confirms that you are on the right path. You are doing what you were made to do. The hardship is meaningful because it is serving something. When you are in a cell without a foreseeable end, the silence raises a different question entirely. What if the story is not going the way you thought it was going? John had a specific expectation of what the coming of the Messiah would look like. It was not an idiosyncratic expectation. It was drawn from the same scriptures that the entire Jewish world of his era was reading and expecting. The prophets had described the day of the Lord in terms of judgment, of separation, of the winnowing that John himself had preached about on the banks of the Jordan. The axe was at the root of the trees. The winnowing fork was in his hand. He would clear his threshing floor. John had expected action, decisive, visible, transforming action. He had expected the wrath and the fire and the judgment that he had been announcing for years. What he heard in the reports from his disciples was something different. Jesus was healing sick people. He was eating with tax collectors and sinners. He was telling parables about seeds and farmers and lost sheep. He was touching lepers. He was talking to Samaritans. He was doing remarkable and beautiful things. He was not, from what John could tell, bringing the kind of decisive intervention that the prophetic tradition had described and that John had been announcing. This is the gap that John was sitting with in his cell. Not a gap between Jesus and some generic expectation. A gap between what John had specifically preached, the message he had staked his whole ministry on, and what seemed to be happening. He had told people a winnowing fork was coming. What came appeared to be a physician. He had preached judgment and found himself in prison while the one he announced ate dinner with sinners. He had prepared a highway in the desert, and now he was in a cell that the highway was apparently not passing through. The darkness at Machaerus was not just the darkness of a physical cell. It was the darkness of a man whose map of reality, the map he had been building and trusting his entire life, was not matching the territory he was in. And here is the thing about that kind of darkness that is easy to miss if you have never been in it. It does not feel like disbelief. It does not feel like turning away from faith or giving up on everything you have built your life on. It feels like honesty. It feels like the honest acknowledgement that what you expected and what you are seeing are not the same thing, and you do not know yet how to account for the difference. John had been preaching for years that people should be honest about what was true rather than hiding behind religious performance. He had called thousands of people to say what was real about themselves instead of pretending. He had made honesty the foundation of everything he taught. He could not do less with his own experience. He was in a cell. Jesus was out there. Things were happening that he had not predicted exactly. and he did not know what to make of the gap. The temptation in these moments, and the religious tradition has always offered a ready supply of tools for managing it, is to close the gap with certainty, to reach for the explanation that makes the dissonance go away, to find the theological framework that accounts for everything and leaves no uncomfortable remainder, to perform confidence. Because confidence is what is expected of people in your position. John did not do that. He did what he had always done. He asked an honest question, and he sent it out from the darkness into the light, toward the one person who could answer it, knowing that whatever came back would be more true than anything he could manufacture inside his cell. He called 2 of his disciples. He gave them a message to carry, and then he sent the question out. Chapter 13. Are you the one? The question from the dark. The 2 disciples made the journey from Machaerus to wherever Jesus was teaching. We do not know how long the trip took. We do not know what they carried with them on the road besides the question. Whether they had provisions or companions or any sense of what they would find when they arrived. Luke tells us simply that John called 2 of his disciples and sent them to the Lord, saying, "Are you the one who is to come? Or shall we look for another?" They found Jesus. They delivered the message. And before we hear the answer, we need to stay with the question itself for longer than most people stay with it. Because this question, asked by this person at this moment, is one of the most important things in the entire New Testament. Not because it demonstrates weakness or failure, because it demonstrates what honest faith actually looks like when it has been pressed hard enough and long enough to reveal what it is made of. Consider who is asking. This is not a skeptic. This is not a Pharisee trying to trap Jesus with a theological puzzle. This is not a Roman official or a curious Gentile or someone who has never encountered the promises in the Hebrew Scriptures. This is John, the man whose mother heard Mary's greeting and felt her child leap for joy in the womb. The man whose father was struck mute in the temple by the angel Gabriel and sang the Benedictus over him at 8 days old. The man who spent 30 years in the desert being formed for a single purpose. The man who stood at the Jordan and saw the heavens open and the Spirit descend and heard the voice from heaven say, "This is my beloved Son." That man is asking, are you the one? There are 2 ways to read this question, and both of them are worth taking seriously because both of them are probably true at the same time. The first reading is pastoral and simple. John is suffering. He is in prison. He has been cut off from his ministry, from the river, from the open sky, from the crowds who came to him, and the work that gave his life its shape and meaning. He is hearing reports about Jesus that are wonderful but that do not match his expectations in ways he cannot fully account for. He is asking because he needs to hear something from Jesus directly. He needs the connection. He needs the confirmation not as an intellectual proposition but as a lived reality. This is the reading that recognizes John as a human being in pain and not just as a theological figure. It is the reading that takes seriously the emotional reality of imprisonment, of isolation, of the particular darkness that comes from having given everything to something and then finding yourself watching from a distance while that something proceeds without you. The second reading is more theologically precise. John had preached a specific vision of what the Messiah's arrival would look like. The winnowing fork, the axe at the root, the judgment and the separation. He had been preaching this for years, with conviction, from the Scriptures he knew inside and out. And now, watching from his cell, he was seeing something that did not obviously match that vision. Jesus was healing and eating and teaching in ways that were extraordinary and clearly significant. But the decisive intervention that John had described did not appear to have arrived. John was asking, with the precision of a man who had thought very carefully about the Scriptures and their meaning, is what you are doing the fulfillment of what I was preaching about? Or do I need to revise my understanding of what the fulfillment is going to look like? This second reading honors John's intelligence and his theological seriousness. He was not asking out of simple emotional distress. He was asking because he had identified a real interpretive question, and he wanted an honest answer. Both readings are probably right. John was a human being in distress who was also a theological thinker who had identified a real question. The distress and the question were not separate. They were the same thing experienced from the inside and the outside simultaneously. Now look at the answer Jesus gave. He did not say yes. He did not say, "Of course I am the one." "John, you saw the heavens open. What are you talking about?" He did not offer reassurance in the form of direct confirmation. He did not say, "Tell John not to worry. I am exactly who he thinks I am." He said, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up. And the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me." That answer is constructed almost entirely from Isaiah. The blind receiving sight, the deaf hearing, the lame walking, the dead raised, the poor hearing good news. These images are drawn from Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61. The same passages that define John's own understanding of the age of the Lord. Jesus was not giving John new information. He was directing John back to the texts John already knew and asking him to look again at what those texts actually said. Isaiah 35, one of the passages Jesus was clearly drawing on, describes the transformation that comes when God visits his people. The wilderness blooms, the desert streams with water, the blind see, the deaf hear, the lame leap like a deer, the mute tongue sings for joy. The highway of holiness runs through the wilderness where no unclean thing walks, and the ransomed of the Lord return with singing, with everlasting joy on their heads. This is not primarily a passage about judgment. It is a passage about restoration. It is a passage about what it looks like when the presence of God comes near to people who have been broken and suffering and waiting for something they could not produce for themselves. Jesus was telling John, look at what is actually happening. Look at the evidence. The blind see. The lame walk. The poor hear good news. These are not incidental details. These are the signs that Isaiah said would characterize the age of the Lord. You have been reading the same texts I am working from. Look again at what they actually describe. And then the last line, "Blessed is the one who is not offended by me." That line is directed at John with complete precision. The word translated as offended comes from the Greek word scandalon, which means a stumbling block, a trap, something that causes a person to trip and fall. Blessed is the person who does not find me to be a stumbling block. Jesus knew that his answer might not be the answer John was hoping for. He knew that the way he was fulfilling the prophetic vision might not match John's expectations exactly. That the winnowing fork had not yet appeared in the visible and dramatic way John had preached. That the judgment John expected had not arrived on the timeline John had anticipated. He was not pretending that the gap John was sitting with was not real. He was acknowledging it and asking John to hold it without letting it cause him to stumble. This is an extraordinary act of pastoral honesty. Jesus did not paper over John's difficulty. He did not offer a cheap resolution. He pointed to evidence, named the genuine tension, and asked John to be the kind of person who could hold an unanswered question without being destroyed by it. The disciples returned to John in his cell. They told him what they had heard and seen. They gave him Jesus' answer. We do not know what John said. We do not know what he felt. The text does not give us his response to the answer. And the silence of that omission is one of the most powerful silences in the entire story. We are not told whether the answer satisfied him, whether it deepened his uncertainty, whether he wept or prayed or sat quietly for a long time. We are told nothing, which may be exactly right. Because the honest answer to the kind of question John asked from the dark is not the kind of answer that closes everything down neatly and sends you to sleep with a settled mind. It is the kind of answer that gives you something real to hold on to while acknowledging that you are still in the dark. that the full resolution has not yet arrived, that the faith you are being asked to practice is faith in the most demanding sense of the word. John was given evidence. He was given the witness of what was happening. He was asked to trust what he had seen and heard at the Jordan, to trust what the reports from his disciples described, to trust the Isaiah passages he knew better than anyone, and to hold all of that together without requiring it to resolve into something tidier than it was. That is a hard thing. It is possibly the hardest thing. And Jesus said, "Blessed is the one who manages to do it." Now the scene shifts. After John's disciples left, Jesus turned to the crowds around him and said something about John that John never heard. These words were spoken publicly, after the messengers had gone, which means John would not have been told about them unless someone specifically sought him out to repeat them. There is no record that anyone did. Jesus said, "What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind. What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing. Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet." He went on, "This is he of whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you.' Truly, I say to you, among those born of women there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. No one greater than John the Baptist." That is the highest commendation Jesus gives to any human being in the Gospels. Not to the disciples who followed him for 3 years. Not to any of the faithful men and women who appear through his ministry. Not to the great figures of the Hebrew tradition, among all people who have ever lived. Jesus said, "None has been greater than John." And John, in his cell at Machaerus, did not hear it. The messengers had left. Jesus was miles away. Whatever Jesus said about John after the messengers departed, John received none of it. He sat in the dark, having sent his question out, and received an answer that required him to keep holding the tension rather than releasing it. He did not hear himself called the greatest. He did not hear Jesus defend him to the crowds with that kind of honor. He had what he had been given, the list from Isaiah, the evidence of what was happening, and the invitation to not stumble. He held it. We do not know for how long. We do not know what the days in the cell were like after the messengers came back. We do not know whether the answer Jesus sent made the waiting easier or whether it simply gave him something more specific to wrestle with. What we know is that he was still in the cell when the birthday party happened. What we know is that the question he had asked was the right question, asked in the right spirit, to the right person, and the answer he received was a real answer. Not a comfortable one, but a real one. The kind that respects the person asking enough not to give them something easier than what is true. It had to be. Chapter 14, The Birthday Party. How prophets die. The occasion was Herod's birthday. In the Roman world of the 1st century, birthday celebrations for rulers were significant public events. They were occasions for displaying wealth and generosity, for cementing relationships with the powerful men whose loyalty you needed, for demonstrating that your court was worthy of the respect of Rome. Herod Antipas, who ruled at the pleasure of the emperor and who was perpetually managing the complicated politics of being a Jewish client king in a Roman system, had every reason to throw a party that communicated stability and magnificence. He invited his lords and military commanders and the leading men of Galilee. The guest list was a map of the power structure he depended on. These were the people whose opinion of him mattered for his continued authority. These were the men he needed to impress. The party was at Machaerus, below the banquet hall, in the cells cut into the rock of the cliff. John was waiting in the dark. Salome, the daughter of Herodias from her previous marriage to Philip, came in and danced before the assembled guests. The text does not tell us what kind of dance it was or how long it lasted. What it tells us is the effect. Herod was pleased. The guests were pleased. And in the warmth of a successful evening, in the looseness that good wine produces in a man who wants to look generous in front of his most important allies, Herod made a promise. "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you." And he vowed to her with an oath, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, up to half of my kingdom." This is the kind of promise that sounds magnificent when you make it, and disastrous the moment you realize what it has committed you to. Half my kingdom is not a real offer. No ruler actually offers half his territory to a dancing girl. It is the language of extravagant generosity. The kind of promise you make when you want to sound impressive, and you are confident that the request will be something manageable. A piece of jewelry, a house, a position for a family member. Salome went out and asked her mother what to request. Herodias did not hesitate. The head of John the Baptist. Salome came back immediately, with urgency, and specified, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Mark tells us that the king was deeply distressed. That detail is important. Not surprised, not outraged, deeply distressed. The Greek word is perilupos, the same word used to describe Jesus in Gethsemane when he said, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." It is a word for genuine anguish, for a level of distress that is not simply inconvenience or social awkwardness. Herod did not want to do this. He had been protecting John for months, possibly longer. He had been holding Herodias back from the execution she wanted. He had been going down to hear John speak and coming back perplexed but drawn. He had recognized something in John that he could not dismiss and had not dismissed it. He had put John in prison to neutralize the political problem John represented. But he had not killed him. And the reason he had not killed him was not political calculation. It was something closer to conscience. And now he had made a public oath in front of every powerful man in his territory. What followed is one of the most devastating sentences in the Gospel of Mark. The king did not want to break his word to her. Because of his oaths and his guests, he did not want to refuse her. Because of his oaths, because of his guests. Not because he believed John deserved death, not because he had concluded that John was dangerous enough to require elimination, not because of any evaluation of John or his ministry or the threat he represented, because of a promise made in public, and because the men sitting around the table had heard the promise made. Herod was more afraid of looking weak in front of his guests than he was of doing something he knew was wrong. That is the mechanism. That is how John the Baptist died. Not through a careful judicial process or a considered decision by a ruler who had weighed the options. Not even through the calculated malice of Herodias acting on her own authority. Through the cowardice of a man who had a choice and made the wrong one because the right one required him to accept embarrassment in front of people whose opinion he valued more than his own conscience. He immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The executioner went to the prison. He beheaded John. He brought the head on a platter and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. The entire sequence, from the dance to the death, happened within the span of a single evening, somewhere below the banquet hall where the guests were still eating and drinking, while the music was still playing and the wine was still flowing, and Herod sat in the distress he had chosen over the alternative of simply saying no to a girl. A man who had seen the heavens open and had spent 30 years preparing for a single purpose had his life ended by an executioner with a sword. No trial, no formal charges, no opportunity to speak in his own defense. No scene of dignified martyrdom with witnesses and last words and the weight of solemn occasion. A sword, a sel, a platter, a party. This is how a great deal of important lives actually end. Not in moments calibrated to their significance. Not in scenes that do justice to the weight of what the person was and did and meant. In the ordinary and often tawdry machinery of human institutions and human weakness and human unwillingness to pay the cost of doing the right thing. Isaiah was killed inside a hollow tree, while Manasseh filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. He did not get a final speech, or a proper funeral, or any of the ceremony that his 6 decades of faithfulness might have seemed to earn. John did not get any of that either. What John got was a group of disciples who came when they heard what had happened, took his body, laid it in a tomb, and went and told Jesus. That last act, they went and told Jesus, is the right ending to this chapter. The disciples did what their teacher had done his whole life. When the most important thing happened, they went to find Jesus and told him about it. The habit of orientation that John had built into them, the practice of turning toward the one John had spent his whole life pointing at, survived even the moment of grief and shock at losing the one who had taught them that habit. They went and told Jesus. Now look at the guest list at Herod's birthday party one more time before we move on. The lords and military commanders and leading men of Galilee, the men whose opinion of Herod mattered, the men in front of whom he could not afford to look weak. They went home that night having attended a birthday party that ended with the execution of the most significant prophetic voice in their generation, because the host had made a rash promise in front of them and did not want to break it. None of them protested. None of them said, Herod, this is wrong. Break your oath. Some things matter more than your reputation in front of your guests. None of them were willing to provide the social cover he would have needed to back down without losing face. They sat at the table and waited for the platter. Power had spoken. A prophet was dead, and the grain and the chaff were still mixed together. Chapter 15. What Jesus said when he heard. Matthew tells it in one sentence. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. That sentence does not contain a single word about what Jesus felt. Matthew does not describe his expression or his posture or the sound of his voice when the news arrived. He does not write that Jesus wept, or that he was angry, or that he said anything at all in the immediate aftermath. He simply records the action. Jesus heard. Jesus withdrew. Jesus went alone to a desolate place. The restraint of that sentence is itself a kind of communication. In the Gospel of John, when Jesus heard that his friend Lazarus had died and saw Mary and the others weeping around him, the text says simply that Jesus wept. 2 words in Greek, the shortest verse in the New Testament. The Gospel writers were not incapable of describing emotion. They chose to record it when it was there to record. Matthew's restraint here is not the restraint of someone who had nothing to say. It is the restraint of someone who understood that what was happening when Jesus withdrew to the desolate place was not something that could be adequately described from the outside. It was interior. It was private. It was the kind of thing that happens in a person when they receive news of a loss that is not simply sad, but is woven into the whole structure of their life and their understanding of what they were doing and why. John was not a stranger to Jesus. He was not a theological category or a fulfilled prophecy or an institutional predecessor. He was family, in the complex and layered sense that family has in that culture. He was the man who had stood at the river and said, I am not worthy to untie his sandals, and then had stood in the water with him when the heavens opened. He was the man who had spent his whole life pointing toward a day that had now arrived, and who had gone to his death in a prison cell below a birthday party, having asked from the dark whether the day was what he had been told it would be. Jesus withdrew. The crowds followed him. Mark tells us that many people saw where he was going, recognized him, ran together from the surrounding towns, and arrived before he did. He had tried to get away alone, and the crowd found him before he could get there. And the text says that when he saw them, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them. There is a quality of grief in that moment that is easy to read past. He had tried to go somewhere alone. He had not made it. And when the crowd arrived, instead of sending them away, instead of asking for the space he had tried to create, he looked at them and felt compassion and began to teach. This is not a small thing. This is a man who had just heard that his cousin, his forerunner, the one who had baptized him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God," had been killed at a birthday party because a king was afraid to break a promise in front of his guests. And when the crowd arrived before he could find the solitude he had gone looking for, he chose the crowd over his grief. He taught them. Then he fed 5,000 of them with 5 loaves and 2 fish. Then he sent the disciples away in a boat, dismissed the crowd, and finally went up the mountain alone to pray. Finally alone. Matthew does not tell us how long he stayed there or what he prayed. What it tells us is that when the disciples were struggling against the wind in the boat in the middle of the night, he came to them walking on the water. He had spent the hours alone on the mountain, after the day that had begun with news of John's death and had continued through the teaching and the feeding of 5,000 and the dismissal of the crowds. He had finally found the time alone that he had been looking for since morning. What happened in those hours is between him and his Father. But we need to look at what Jesus said publicly about John, because those words were spoken in the days around John's question from prison, and they constitute the most extended public reflection Jesus ever gave about another person. After John's disciples returned to their teacher with the answer about the blind seeing and the lame walking, Jesus turned to the crowd and asked them 3 questions about John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind. The image of a reed shaken by the wind is specific to the geography of the Jordan Valley. The riverbanks were lined with reeds, hollow stalks that bent in every direction with the wind. To call someone a reed shaken by the wind was to describe a person without inner stability, someone who changed direction based on the pressures around them, someone whose convictions were as reliable as a plant in a breeze. Was that what you went out to see? Because if so, you went to the wrong river. John was the man who told Herod directly, to his face, in language that could not be misunderstood, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." He was the man who called the Pharisees and Sadducees a brood of vipers when they came to manage him. He was the man who asked from prison whether Jesus was the one, because he needed to know, not because he had given up. Reeds do not ask questions like that. Reeds bend in whatever direction the pressure is coming from. John bent for no one. He moved only when he was moving towards something true. What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing. Those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. Soft clothing, the robes of the court, the fine linen of the temple establishment, the carefully maintained appearance of people who needed to be seen as belonging to the right institutions and the right families and the right positions in the hierarchy. John wore camel hair, not as a costume or a statement of fashion or a deliberate provocation, as the clothing of a man who had spent 30 years in the desert and had no interest in the social signals that expensive clothing sends. He owed nothing to the institutions that soft clothing represented. He had never been inside their systems. He had no position to protect and no patron to please. The camel hair was not theater. It was the natural uniform of a man who had organized his entire life around a single purpose and had stripped away everything that did not serve that purpose. You went out to the Jordan to see someone who was not dressed in soft clothing. Jesus was saying, and you found him. That part of what you were looking for was right. What then did you go out to see? A prophet. Yes, a prophet. But more than a prophet. More than a prophet. In the tradition John stood in, the prophets were the highest human category available. They were the ones who had stood between God and the people and said what needed to be said when it needed to be said. Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and all the way back to Moses, who was the pattern prophet, the one against whom all others were measured. More than a prophet placed John in a category that had no previous occupant. And then Jesus quoted Malachi, "Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you." The messenger, the one Malachi had promised at the close of the Hebrew Scriptures. The fulfillment of 400 years of waiting. Jesus was telling the crowd that John was the one they had been waiting for, without knowing they were waiting for him specifically. And then the sentence that has generated more theological discussion than almost any other thing Jesus said about John. Truly, I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. The first part is clear in its meaning, if not in its full implication. No one greater than John. Not David. Not Moses. Not Isaiah or Jeremiah or any of the prophets across the entire span of the Hebrew tradition. The greatest human being who had ever lived, by Jesus' own evaluation, was the man currently sitting in a cell at Machaerus, having asked whether Jesus was the one. But then the second part, the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Scholars have worked through this sentence from every possible angle across 2,000 years. And the interpretations tend to fall into two broad categories. The first reads the two parts as describing a discontinuity. John belongs to the old era, the era of the law and the prophets. The kingdom of heaven represents something new, a new era inaugurated by Jesus' coming. In the old era, John is the greatest. But even the smallest person in the new era is in a better position than the greatest person in the old era, simply because of when they are in the story. The second reads the sentence as a comment on categories rather than individuals. The least in the kingdom of heaven functions like saying the smallest star in the sky. It refers to the category, not to any specific person who is somehow less than John. The point is that the thing John was preparing for, the kingdom of heaven, is of a different and higher order than the preparation for it. And participation in what John was preparing for exceeds even the honor of being the one who prepared the way. Both interpretations are pointing at the same reality from different angles. John was the last and greatest figure in the era of preparation. What he prepared for exceeded the preparation. The arrival exceeds the announcement of the arrival. And John had known this. He had said it himself. He must increase. I must decrease. Jesus was confirming it from the outside, from the perspective of the one who was increasing, with a tenderness toward John that the words carry even across 2,000 years of translation and retelling. Among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater. John never heard that. He was in his cell when Jesus said it. The messengers had gone. The crowd Jesus was speaking to was somewhere in Galilee, not at Machaerus. Whatever reached John from the world outside his cell reached him through his disciples. And we have no record that this particular speech was ever relayed to him. He went to his death not knowing that Jesus had said this about him. Or perhaps he knew something better than that. Perhaps what he had been told. The answer that came back to him via his two disciples. The list from Isaiah and the invitation to not stumble was sufficient. Perhaps the faith that had carried him through 30 years in the desert and the height of his public ministry and the cell at Machaerus was the kind of faith that did not require the external confirmation of being told how the person you had served evaluated you. He had done what he was sent to do. He had prepared the way. He had pointed at the one who was coming. He had accepted his own diminishment as fulfillment rather than failure. He had asked his honest question from the dark and received an honest answer and held on to it. The rest was not his to know. What we know, looking back across the full span of the story, is that Jesus honored John with the highest commendation he gave to any human being. And we know that John went to his death in a prison cell below a birthday party without hearing it. That gap between what John deserved to hear and what he actually heard is one of the most human things in the whole story. It is not resolved in the text. It is simply present. The way these gaps are simply present in real lives. The affirmations that arrive after the person who needed them most is no longer in a position to receive them. When the disciples came and told Jesus that John was dead, he withdrew in a boat to a desolate place by himself. He went to find the solitude that the news required. The crowd found him before he got there. He looked at them and felt compassion. He began to teach them again. That is the man John had spent his whole life pointing toward. Not a figure of distant power or abstract theology, A man who received the news that his cousin was dead, tried to grieve alone, got interrupted by thousands of people who needed something from him, felt compassion for them, and began to teach. The ministry continued, because that was the point. That was always the point. Go back to the cell. Not to the birthday party or the platter or the guests at the table who sat and waited. Go back to the cell. To the man in the dark. To the moment before the messengers arrived with the answer. John was sitting with a question he had not been able to resolve from the inside. He had the evidence of the Jordan, the open heavens and the descending Spirit and the voice from above. He had the 30 years of formation in the desert, the accumulated weight of a life organized entirely around a single purpose. He had the Isaiah passages and the Malachi promise and everything the Hebrew tradition had been building toward across 1,000 years of history. He had all of that, and he still needed to ask. The asking did not cancel what he had. It did not erase the Jordan or the desert or the decades of preparation. It sat alongside all of it, honest and unresolved, in the particular darkness of a cell above the Dead Sea. Are you the one who is to come? Or shall we look for another? This question has been asked in every generation since John asked it. Not always in those exact words, not always from prison cells, but the substance of it, the honest acknowledgement that what you believe and what you are experiencing do not obviously match, that the God you have committed your life to does not always appear to be operating on the schedule or in the manner you expected, that the darkness you are sitting in is real and not easily explained away by the theological certainties that felt more solid in the light. That question is alive in every person who has stood at a grave that arrived too soon, in every person who has prayed faithfully for years and received what felt like silence, in every person who has done what they believed they were supposed to do and found themselves not at the destination they expected, but in a place they did not choose and cannot easily leave. John did not invent that question. He is simply the most honest example of someone who asked it, refused to pretend he was not asking it, and sent it where it needed to go. And the answer he received is the answer that is still being given. Go and tell John what you hear and see. Evidence, specific and real. The blind receiving sight, the lame walking, the poor hearing good news. Go and look at what is actually happening and measure it against what the texts you already know actually say. And then blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Blessed is the person who can hold the tension between what they expected and what they got, who can sit with the unanswered remainder without letting it destroy what they know to be true, who can trust the evidence they have been given even when it does not resolve into the certainty they were hoping for. That is a hard blessing to receive. It does not feel like comfort in the moment. It feels like being asked to do something difficult. It is being asked to do something difficult. John sat in the dark and held it. He had been formed for that holding by 30 years in a desert, by everything his father had sung over him at 8 days old, by the questions and the crowds and the river and the open sky and the voice that had confirmed what he had given his life to. All of that formation had been preparation not just for the ministry at the Jordan but for the cell at Machaerus, not just for the public moments but for the private darkness. He must increase. I must decrease. John said that at the height of his public work, when the diminishment was still theoretical, still something he understood in his head, the cell at Machaerus was where the diminishment became real, where the decrease happened in practice, where the person who had been the most talked about figure in Judea was reduced to a man in a room waiting for news from outside. He held it, and what he held, it turns out, was not his alone to hold. 20 years after John's execution, in a city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, a Jewish man named Apollos stood up in a synagogue and began to teach about Jesus. Luke describes him with almost extravagant praise. Apollos was eloquent. He was competent in the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord. He was fervent in spirit. He taught accurately the things concerning Jesus. but he knew only the baptism of John. A couple named Aquila and Priscilla heard him teaching. They recognized what was missing. They took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. A few chapters later, in Acts, Paul arrived in Ephesus and found 12 disciples. He asked them, "Did you receive the Holy Spirit when you believed?" They said, "We have not even heard that there is a Holy Spirit." He asked, "Into what then were you baptized?" They said, "Into John's baptism." 12 people. In Ephesus, roughly 20 years after John's death, had received John's baptism of repentance and had built their faith on that foundation. They had not yet received the rest of what John had been pointing toward. They knew the preparation. They had not yet received the thing prepared for. Paul explained to them about Jesus. He baptized them. He laid his hands on them. The Holy Spirit came on them. John had done his work so well that people were still standing on it 20 years later in a city he had never visited, waiting for someone to explain what it was the foundation was meant to support. The voice that cried in the wilderness ended in a cell above the Dead Sea, and the echo of that voice reached a synagogue in Ephesus 2 decades later. Still carrying the same essential posture, turn around. Acknowledge what is true about yourself. Go into the water, and come out ready for what is coming. The forerunner who announced the arrival did not live to see what the arrival produced. The man who was told from birth that his life would be organized around someone else's story died in someone else's fortress, at someone else's party, because of someone else's oath. And the echo of his voice is still moving through the world. John was not the light. He came to testify to the light, and the testimony is still standing. The question he asked from the dark is the most honest question faith can ask, and the answer it received is the most honest answer faith can be given. Go and tell John what you hear and see. The wilderness is still producing voices. The river is still running. And the question, the one that John could not stop asking even from a cell above the Dead Sea, is still the right question. Are you the one? Take the time you need with it. But take it seriously, because the man who asked it did.